Hey everyone, so it's Hearth and welcome back to my channel. So on today's video we are going to be talking about the history of witches' balls. So witches' balls have been used for several hundred years, not only in Europe but also in North America. They have a whole range of different traditions connected to them and lots of different varieties over time. They are one of the longest standing items within magical practice and have been seen gently adapting over the past several hundred years, changing depending on the times and also the location where these witches' balls were used. Now, they weren't only used by witches, they were also used by laymen alike, so it's one of the few magical traditions that's actually used by not only witches, but also just normal day-to-day folk. So the history of witches' balls really dates back to the history of glass blowing. So witches' balls traditionally were blown glass. Now originally they weren't created for any magical or spiritual intention, they were actually created as buoys, floating devices that were attached onto nets so that they didn't sink into the ocean when we were fishing. Traditionally, they were either clear or they were coloured glass, often green or blue, that was then macrameed into an attachment for a net, so that when fishermen would cast the nets out into the ocean, they wouldn't just sink. So originally they had a very practical purpose. They were solely used as floating buoys for nets, so they didn't just sink to the ocean floor. Slowly over time, they began to develop more and more spiritual connections, and slowly but surely, we see what we would now refer to as a witch's ball developing. So witches' balls began to be connected to witches during the witch trials of the 1500s. Now, at this point, it was a very loose connection, a very loose association, I might want to add. The premise being that witches were believed to be rejected from water. They weren't allowed to be in water, so rather than sinking, they would float to the surface, which we now know is just basic human biology, but people in the 1500s believed that if you sank, you were innocent, and if you floated, you were a witch. Now, this very closely connected witches to the buoys that were used on nets, as these too were not sinkable. You couldn't sink one of these glass balls unless it had a hole in it and water was allowed inside. They were sealed. And so they slowly became more and more connected to witches. And then suddenly their use kind of changes quite drastically. They were still being used to float nets to the surface, but now they started to be made in slightly different ways. They were originally just sealed. Their blowing technique changed slightly, and when they were blowing these glass spheres, now there were strands of very fine glass inside. They were like filaments inside these glass balls. And slowly their practice and their purpose started changing. The bright colours began to come in and people were making more and more vivid balls, more decorative balls. We start seeing them in brighter shades of blue, brighter shades of green, as well as other colours, depending on what was available in the areas that these glass balls were being blown. And then the use of them began to change. Within some cultures, it was believed that the bright colours attracted spirits. And when they attracted the spirit would enter the ball and it would get tangled up on all of those glass strands that were inside, and it was no longer able to escape. They were used as spirit traps, and this is probably one of the earliest forms of spirit trap that we start seeing. So one form was to actually hang these balls on windows, sometimes it was the eastern window, or to keep it in a room or outside a property where you didn't want spirits around. So you would hang these coloured balls outside and they would entrap spirits inside, and then when you needed to get rid of that ball, you would then send it away so that you weren't just releasing the spirits again. These balls were commonly created in multiples and hang on different areas of the house to ensure protection. That's one form that they were used. Another form was that they were believed to repel the evil eye. So they were often made in a vivid blue colour, and they were hung and kept around a property to protect from the evil eye's effect. Now this is seen today in the Nazar charms, the evil eye charms that you can have on bracelets or as glass hangings. So they've developed over the years to become something different. They started off as blue spheres of glass and slowly became flat sheets of glass that were made to look like eyes. And so Nazar charms came out of witches' balls as time went on. In other regions, they were very traditionally referred to as witch balls, because at this point in time in the 17th and 18th century, it was believed that witches either didn't have a reflection or they couldn't bear to look at their own reflection. And so people would often keep witches' balls in the property as a way to deter witches. If you couldn't tell which member of your community was a witch, if you hung a witch's ball or a mirror inside your house, they wouldn't be able to be within your property because either they didn't have a reflection and didn't want to be noticed as not having a reflection, or they hated looking at their reflection so much that they couldn't bear to be in the room where the reflective ball was or where the hanging mirrors were, and so they would flee from the property. Now, it's very obvious now that the understanding in the 18th and 17th century wasn't quite right, as practitioners of witchcraft have reflections just like everyone else. But back then, that was a really well-believed theory, was that witches, they couldn't stand looking at their own reflection. So witches' balls was then a term that was used to describe these protective spheres. Now, depending on the tradition and depending on the location, the colours, style and purpose of the ball would change. So in some areas the balls were sealed. There was no way of putting anything inside. In some areas they had these strands of glass inside them that were believed to trap spirits, and in other regions they were open, so you could actually add fibrous items inside of them. Going outside of just European tradition, you actually see balls similar to the idea of the witches' balls found in a huge range of different locations around the world. We found beeswax spheres with fibrous strands of hair mixed into it, used as protective charms to ward against spirits. We found similar items all over the world used to do similar things. But the items that are used very much depends on the region of the world where these balls were found. So within Europe, glass was very popular at this time. People were starting to put glass in their homes. It was very popular to have glass objects, and it was often seen as something of a luxury. If you could have these glass witches' balls, you were considered to be someone very significant that could afford this type of protection against spirits and witches. In other regions where glass was less well used, you find that other items are used instead. So these beeswax balls are often used, or wooden balls were used as well, depending on the area in which they were found. The idea of them being able to trap spirits inside is something that's relatively well used throughout the entire world. Where the witches' balls were placed also changes depending on where you are in the world. In some regions, these balls were carried around as almost personal talismans of protection. In other areas, they were placed in certain areas of the home, whether inside or outside, to shield against certain things. So often, if it was to shield against spirits, they were placed on the front porch of a property. If they were used to protect against witches, they were placed inside, in different rooms, in different compass points, depending on what the intended outcome was. Often they were placed on the eastern side of a property, whether inside or outside. Sometimes they were placed on either side of the front door, on the outside or the inside. Sometimes they were placed in windows, depending on the tradition, in different locations of the house. Sometimes they were very specifically placed in certain rooms. So as is quite common with Nazar charms, they're often kept around babies and around small infants, often above cribs or in the space itself, and some witches' balls were treated in a similar way, especially if they were to deflect the evil eye. They were kept around children in order to protect them from the evil eye's influence over them. So the use of them really depends on where you are in the world and what the belief around these glass spheres actually was. Now, sailors were notoriously superstitious, and they would often take talismans or protective items on boats with them. So in the 19th century, sailors actually took the European witches' balls with them when they travelled over to North America, and so you start seeing witches' balls appearing in North America. But with a new country comes a new style. If anything, they became more seamless and streamlined over in the New World compared to how they were used within Europe in its different regions. Within Europe, they were largely coloured, vivid colours, blue, green. They were sometimes very decorative with paintings on them, drawings, designs, symbols. They often had these filaments inside. They were usually opaque, so you couldn't actually see inside. When you went over to North America, they suddenly changed quite drastically. The colour often was taken out, so they were actually just plain, whether that was clear or milky in colour. And they were used in different ways. Often they were just used as glass spheres, and they were actually kept outside, often in gardens, and they became exceptionally popular to have by the upper class individuals in North America, and they were kept as what's known as gazing balls in their back gardens or in their large green spaces. Now, gazing balls are one of the originators of what we would now refer to as a crystal ball, a clear sphere that is used for scrying purposes and other divinatory techniques. So there's a lot of things that kind of came out of the idea of these witches' balls. So they were very popular over in North America, often kept in gardens and used by practitioners or divinatory readers for scrying. So rather than using water or scrying mirrors, they were now using these glass spheres as a way of tapping into the subconscious and the psychic energy and working with it to find insight to a question or a new opportunity that might be coming about. They were also found very readily being peddled by street practitioners selling their wares to people that were worried about negative spirits, negative intentions, and witches casting their spells on them. They start to be sold. And often they would end up in very high society homes. During the Victorian era, it almost became a trend to have these witches' balls around your property, these glass balls. It was a time of mysticism and spiritualism where a lot of mediums and tarot readers were exceptionally popular. You'd often find a lot of seances happening between the late 1800s and the mid 1900s, and this was really the time where the popularity of the witches' ball really took off in the modern way. Now, witches' balls have been used for so many different things. I've mainly mentioned the techniques for protection and shielding, but in Appalachian folk magic, they were often used for sending curses towards targeted individuals. They have lots of different purposes over time, but primarily they were used for protection. As we started entering into the late 1900s, we start seeing witches' balls taking on a whole new look. They now look more like traditional baubles, and it might actually be the originator of the Christmas bauble that we see today. The idea of blown glass balls, often vividly coloured, may well have been taken directly from the hanging of witches' balls that was done for the past 300-400 years. So it could well be that our modern baubles on Christmas trees actually came from witches' balls. But now, we not only might see them on Christmas trees, but they also are very readily available in occult shops. Lots of people make them and sell them to people that need them, not only for protection, but also for lots of other purposes as well. So today, you do still see people creating traditional witches' balls with the strands inside, the coloured blown glass, often hand blown rather than machine blown. But you also see a different type of witch's ball, the type that I'm going to be showing you in an upcoming video of how to make for yourself. And they are witch's balls that contain items that represent your intention. They've developed even further over time, and now it's not just about them being a spherical object. Now it's about what you put inside. It takes many different traditions and gathers it all into the idea of the modern witch's ball. So it's very similar to the puppet magic that was seen in Europe. It's also very similar to sachet workings and other such representative workings that are found all around the world. The idea with modern witches' balls is not only that it's a spherical object that is used to deflect negativity in some cases. It's not just about hanging them to protect or bring intention into a space. It's also about what you put inside. So you can add items in to allow it to be a traditional witch's ball, to add in the items that deflect negativity or the items that catch negativity. They can also be used to attract good luck, money, love, happiness, peace, joy, depending on the items that you add inside. So over time, they have become this very adaptive practice that has changed as the times have changed. So although you can find the very traditional witch's balls still, if that's what you're interested in, you can also make them almost like a witch's bottle. And they are actually probably the originator of the modern witch's bottle. They are now used in slightly different ways than witches' bottles, as both of these practices have kind of split off from one another. But it's likely that witches' balls were the original witches' bottle, used to protect the home and the family from negative energy, almost acting as a scapegoat. So the working that I'm going to be showing you in the next video actually works with witches' balls in a way of acting as a protective charm, a protective talisman that you add into windows or in rooms to offer protection. Often they contain protective herbs, protective items, petitions, intentions, as well as in some cases reflective properties, much like the very traditional witches' balls that were used to show a witch's reflection to scare them away. Now they're used not necessarily to scare away witches, but usually by witches to either store negative spirits or to deflect away negative energies. Depending on the items that you put in them changes what you want them to do. If you want it to attract in money, you might add in items that all represent money and prosperity, and you might hang it just in the doorway or in your office, by your computer, in your business or your shop if you want to attract money into that particular premises. If you wanted to use one for love, you might fill it full of items that represent that loving intention, and you might hang it above your bed or in your bedroom to attract love into your life. There are now so many different ways to work with witches' bottles, and it's such a diverse practice, which is very much changed from the original use of them as fishing buoys. So that is just a very brief rundown of witches' balls. I really hope that you found it useful. If you did, feel free to give it a like. It really means so much to me. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, video ideas, or just want to chit chat with the community down in the comment section, feel free to post a comment. If you do enjoy the magical content on this channel or in this video, feel free to hit subscribe. I try my best to post magical content every Wednesday and every Saturday at 6 p.m. And a massive, huge shout out to all of my Patreon supporters. You guys are amazing, and your names will be appearing on the end screen in just a few moments. If you would also like to support the channel, the Patreon link is down in the description box, but no pressure. I'm happy with you just watching this video. So I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous magical day, and I will see you in the next video.